welcome to all of you joining us for today's online conversation with special guest Rachael Denhollander on how much is a child worth: power, protection, and abuse prevention. This is actually our first online conversation of 2022. We took a month off for the holidays. Hope you all had a very Merry Christmas and your New Year's off to a great start. And we're really delighted that you could join us today. I want to also thank our sponsors and co-hosts, Byron Carlock, a special anonymous donor, as well as our co-host and sponsors in this today's program, the DeVries Center at Calvin University. And we're delighted that so many of you have joined us for this first online conversation of the year. I believe we have over 1,600 registrants from at least 24 different countries that we know of, ranging from Argentina to South Africa. So a special welcome to you all. If you are one of those first-time guests joining us or are otherwise new to the Trinity Forum, we work to cultivate, curate, and promote the best of Christian thought leadership and provide a place where leaders can wrestle with the big questions of life and come to better know the author of the answers. And we hope that today's conversation will be a small taste of that for you today. The question we're going to grapple with today is both sobering and extraordinarily important. How do we discern, understand, and prevent abuse of the most vulnerable? In the last few years, virtually every sector of society, whether it's entertainment, media, journalism, government, sports, education, technology, and including the church, has been rocked by scandals of sexual abuse. In many cases, bringing to light decades-long abuses that went unchecked and victims unheeded. Worse, many institutions, and let's be honest, including ministries and churches, have responded to reports of abuse with denial, dismissal, or even denunciation, prioritizing the protection of the organization or the leader over the victim. The fallout has not only profoundly damaged already hurting and vulnerable people, but destroyed families, communities, and even riven entire denominations. So how do we learn to recognize the signs and the dynamics of the misuse of power, institute wise protections, and encourage justice and healing amidst the widespread damage that abuse always brings? These are certainly not easy questions, but they are essential and urgent ones. And it's hard to imagine someone who has wrestled with them with more courage, resolve, or insight than our guest today, Rachael Denhollander. Rachael is an attorney, an author, and an advocate who first became known as the woman to first pursue criminal charges and speak on the record about the abuses of USA Gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar. As a result of her advocacy and her example, eventually over 300 women, including several Olympic medalists, also came forward as survivors of Nassar's abuse, eventually resulting both in his life imprisonment and the exposure of large-scale complicity that eventually resulted in a more than $500 million settlement with Michigan State University and a further settlement of nearly $400 million with USA Gymnastics. She has been named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world, one of Glamour Magazine's Women of the Year in 2018, and just a few months ago received the 2021 Abraham Kuyper Prize for Excellence in Reformed Theology and Public Life from our co-host, the DeVries Institute at Calvin College. She's also the author of several books, including What is a Girl Worth?, which we've invited her to discuss today, as well as her articles appearing in many journals, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and Vox. Rachael, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this for weeks.
Well, us as well, Rachael. And to start off, many people who are watching us are probably at least somewhat aware of your story, but there's also going to be a lot of people who aren't. And so I wanted to start off just by asking you about your own story. And the man who abused you, Larry Nassar, served for 18 years as the team doctor for the USA Gymnastics team, which gave him access to hundreds of girls, of course. You were the first person to go to the police and go on record accusing him, which, as we said earlier, led to almost 300 women following suit. And you did that years after the abuse had first occurred and you struggled with the aftermath. And so I wanted to start out by asking you what eventually led you to take that step of reporting?
Yeah, that is one of my favorite questions to answer because often there's this misunderstanding. And the question we often ask is, how do we empower victims to raise their voice? And that's an important question. But most survivors, and myself included, they're willing to speak up if there's a hope that there's going to be any success in speaking up. And so we're somewhat asking the wrong question. The question isn't so much how do we make survivors want to speak up, as much as it is how do we create systems and cultures where survivors can speak up and be heard. And that really was what I was struggling against ever since I was abused by Larry. I saw him from ages 15 to 16. And the first time he began doing something that I wasn't quite sure was right, I had this very distinct thought process as a 15-year-old. I thought, this is clearly something he does regularly. There's no way that the hundreds of Olympic athletes and children that he's been treating for years haven't described what's going on in the exam room before. Surely someone has described this. If there was any question about the legitimacy of this medical treatment, the adults in authority would have asked the right questions. See, I knew already at that point in time that pelvic floor therapy was a real thing, that it required specialized training and certification. So I presumed that, of course, Larry was a certified pelvic floor therapist. And if there was any question about that, somebody would have asked. He's clearly doing this regularly. There's no way someone hasn't described it. And if they had, the adults in authority would have done the right thing. The fact that I'm in here means the right questions have been asked, and this is okay. This is legitimate therapy. And when I started to realize much later in treatment, when he crossed a line that I knew was abuse, then the question became, what else might I have missed? And as I began to research what pelvic floor therapy should look like and eventually disclosed to my mom, and we started talking through those realities, I realized he is doing this every day. Most likely people have spoken up, and it's that they've been systematically silenced. And so my mom and I had a conversation when I was around 17 years old. Excuse me, my allergies are killing me today. And the conversation that we had is, what do we do with this? You're not going to be the first, and you're not going to be the last. And I said to my mom at that point in time at 17, one anonymous person cannot do this, because whoever has spoken up before is being silenced. And the fact that he's still seeing patients over the last 2 years as I've been figuring things out means that whoever's speaking up in the interim is still being silenced. We're going to have press coverage. And so my mom and I actually talked at 17 years old about going down to the news station and giving them my story and seeing if we could reach other survivors enough to take the narrative away from Larry's control. Because that's what was going to have to happen. Somebody was going to have to wrest control from him in a way that allowed the truth to be heard. And I knew I wasn't just up against Larry. I was up against a Big Ten university. I was up against USAG, the national governing body for our Olympic team. They make the most money oftentimes out of every Summer Olympics. That meant I was fighting the United States Olympic Committee, and they're chartered by the Senate. Now I'm fighting the Senate, potentially. And I also knew the statistics for how rapes are investigated, how sexual assault is investigated. Out of every 300 rapes reported to the police, only on average 5 to 6 result in criminal charges and conviction and jail time. So I knew that was what was going to have to happen. And there was just no way to do that at that point in time. Reporting was so difficult and different on sexual assault. And at 17, I had no idea how to even make that happen. So really what I was waiting for was an opportunity to be heard and believed. I wasn't unwilling to speak up. There was no avenue for me to speak up and have any hope of succeeding.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that really struck me in reading your story is that even before you went to the police or went on record, you had spoken up. And what had prompted you to do so was hearing that a coach that you trusted was about to refer a little girl to therapy for Larry. And at that point, you went to the coach who you trusted and who clearly cared for you.
Yeah.
And she conferred with her husband, who was a police officer, and after consideration decided not to believe you.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to ask you about those dynamics, because clearly this is a person of good faith who's trying to do the right thing,
Absolutely.
who cares about you. And you see those dynamics repeated so often. And yet the question asked exactly what you were saying. Why haven't they reported? So tell us a little bit about what the dynamics are in place that inhibit even well-meaning people, with caring hearts who care for the vulnerable, from being able to discern or believe when abuses of power exist.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the vast majority of time, certainly not all the time, we see astonishing levels of corruption. And we saw that in the Nassar case. But much of the time, when there has been an enabling of abuse, it's not so much a bunch of men sitting in a cigar filled room going, we think child abuse is fine and we're going to let it continue. We know so and so is a predator. We cognitively realize this and we're still going to let it continue. You do have those situations, you absolutely have them. But a lot of time, the enabling really looks very different. It's somebody who lacks education, lacks the tools and the skills necessary to both recognize the abuse and know how to respond to it. And really what we're fighting against is a lack of understanding on trauma and trauma dynamics, and a lack of understanding on abuse and abusive dynamics. We don't understand what abuse typically looks like, and we don't understand the trauma responses that survivors have. And so more often than not, when a survivor speaks up, the immediate question, whether it's verbalized or internal, is, how is that possible? Because. And then the person asking that question, who you've disclosed to, has a set of reasons why this person couldn't be an abuser, or why the abuse couldn't have happened the way you've described. Because we don't understand abusive dynamics and we don't understand trauma responses. And what we've got to wrestle with is that abusers are very skilled manipulators. They know how to create personas that make it seem impossible to abuse, and they know how to create situations that make it seem like it's impossible for abuse to occur. It's actually incredibly common for abuse to take place right out in the open, or in close proximity to somebody who could save that child or that individual. This is not uncommon even in adult abuse, for abuse to take place in close proximity to other individuals, because abusers know that either the freeze response or the confusion that they have created in their victim is going to prevent them oftentimes from crying out, or for asking for help, knowing what to do with the situation. And that in turn, when the survivor discloses, the immediate response is, if that had happened, surely you would have said something. So abusers create personas and dynamics where it appears to us that abuse can't take place because we don't understand those dynamics. And what we have to understand is that when we have that automatic response, that's not possible, because we've actually done exactly what the abuser wanted us to do. We have been conditioned to believe that it couldn't have happened. And we're using the exact same thought processes they wanted us to use. And as confusing and disorienting as it might be for someone who is receiving that disclosure, imagine how much more disorienting and confusing it is for the victim who has experienced that abuse and is trying to reconcile what they've experienced with the person or the situation that wasn't anything like what it looked like. We've got to understand those things better so that we can recognize it when it comes and know what to do with it when we receive it.
You mentioned offhandedly just how widespread this is, and that's something I wanted to ask you about, in that there's still in many cases a widespread sense that this is a bit of a rarity, that Nassar was an incredible monster. But then I was just sort of thinking about the recent cases. I mean, earlier this week, there was a settlement of almost $500 million out of the University of Michigan. I mean, the university decided it was better to pay $500 million than to go to court. Earlier this year, a $1.1 billion settlement from USC over a gynecologist they had employed. In 2018, $500 million from MSU, several other universities as well as, of course, what's happened with the Catholic Church, the Houston Chronicle expose of independent fundamental Baptist churches and Southern Baptist churches. And yet, even with all of these scandals and settlements, there is a widespread sense that this is relatively rare. There was a recent Lifeway poll that found that pastors estimate that around 10% of their parishioners have experienced abuse at one point. And I think the CDC estimates that actually 1 in 4 women have. So I wanted to ask you both, how widespread is abuse, and what accounts for this perception gap, particularly among Christian leaders?
Yeah, there is an astonishing perception gap, and it's really inexcusable. At this point in time, we have the data. We've had the data literally for decades to know how widespread this is. Experts have been saying for decades this is dramatically undercounted Even what we know is dramatically undercounted, and the statistic has stayed right around 1 in 4 women for sexual violence. By the time they reach age 18, it's actually a little bit higher for the 18 to 24, the college years. A little bit over 1 in 4 women will experience sexual violence in their college years. And it tapers a little bit, and sometimes dramatically as we get a little bit older. But what we haven't wrestled with is even the high rates of elder abuse taking place in nursing homes. These are not uncommon dynamics. If you add domestic violence into that question, you're looking at closer to 1 in 3. If you add male sexual violence, male survivors of sexual violence, you're looking at least 1 in 6. And in all of these categories, experts are saying we've dramatically undercounted still. And the rates continue to rise. And so there really isn't any excuse at this point in time for not knowing that data. But sometimes it is emotionally easier to not know that data. And all of us have this intrinsic desire to not have to see the darkness that's around, and to not have to comprehend that. But there is no greater cowardice than chosen ignorance. And at this point in time, the ignorance is nothing but chosen. The data is there and we've had it, it's available. And it's a lack of intentionality and prioritization also. If you think about all of the church programs or ministry programs we typically have, if you had, say, 1 in 4 members of your congregation actively battling cancer, or 1 in 4 members of your congregation experiencing being widowed or losing a spouse, chances are you would have some level of intentional ministry to those individuals. Maybe you'd have a support group or a Bible study for them. You would have meal trains to help provide for their physical needs. There would be a level of intentionality in ministering to those individuals. But we don't see the same level of intentionality in ministering to those who have been sexually assaulted. What it demonstrates is a lack of understanding the damage and a lack of prioritizing how severe and serious this is. And when you don't prioritize something, you have knowledge gaps because you haven't taken the time to learn.
You mentioned the seriousness of it. And on one hand, I think this is something we can probably all imagine, but I also think it's helpful to hear from someone who's actually experienced it, which is what the impact is, particularly on a teenager having gone through this. How does it affect your development? How does it affect your kind of emotional and physical well-being?
The neurobiology of trauma is something that the church has not wrestled with in any significant fashion. I highly recommend the book, The Body Keeps the Score, because what that does is it lays out the actual physical damage from trauma, what happens in our neurology, the cascading chemical responses that creates, the cascading physical realities and physical symptoms that creates. And it really takes trauma out of the realm of soul wound and puts it more correctly in the realm of soul and body wound. And so I highly recommend that book to any ministry leader because you need to understand the physical realities of trauma. But it really rewires everything. If you understand how our memories and how our brains work, you can think back to a positive childhood memory and you might remember it very vividly. You'll remember what you smelled and what you felt and the sounds around it. You might even have an emotional response to that memory. I can smell my grandmother's perfume and I'm just flooded with memories and emotions when I smell that because we have had neurological connections. I've had neurological connections form in response to that sensory input. Well, when you experience trauma, you have neurological connections form along with the emotional responses that you're experiencing and with the sensory input that you're experiencing at that point in time. Those connections form, they're there. And so when those pathways get triggered, it can cause very disorienting flashbacks to survivors. It puts them physically right back in the position they were in when they were abused. That flood of fight or flight hormones and chemicals, the anxiety, the fear. Oftentimes, traumatic memories are stored differently in the brain. They're stored in the region that processes current sensory input. They haven't been stored in the region for past input. So when a survivor experiences a flashback, they're often not remembering in 2D form. They're remembering in 3D form, meaning they don't remember the smell, they smell it again. They don't remember what they felt, they feel it again. And this keeps the survivor's body in a constant state of being flooded with stress hormones, which creates cascading physical realities and emotional realities for the survivor and causes continued neurologic damage to the survivor. And when you don't understand those realities, it makes it very difficult to know how to walk alongside someone who has suffered well. It makes it difficult to understand what they're experiencing and what things are going to be helpful or harmful. And it also makes it difficult to know when you need to help them get expert care. And that's another significant hurdle that we see in the churches. Oftentimes, pastors are not equipped to recognize when they're not equipped to handle something. And so the survivor doesn't get the kind of care, the kind of multifaceted approach to healing that they really need. It's just, again, we've got a knowledge gap because we have an intentionality gap.
Mhm. I go back to part of that knowledge gap. You'd said earlier that one of our challenges is, for many of us, it's hard to recognize both the dynamics and structures and conditions of abuse. And so would love to kind of hear from you. How does one recognize, how does one discern both, recognize abusers and discern abuse? None of us want to be the people who have had abuse happening in close proximity to us without the eyes to see it.
Yeah. The very first thing we have to do is be willing to see the darkness. You have to start understanding how abusers think and how they operate, what those grooming procedures look like, how they manipulate the environment around them. You have to start understanding all of the ways that abuse can take place, how it can take place in a public situation or take place in close proximity to someone else, understanding how it takes place in the darkness, the level of organization that is sometimes accompanying child abuse. Especially when we're looking at human trafficking, the production of child sexually abusive materials, there's a wide range of situations that we have to grasp and dynamics that we have to be able to grasp, or you're not going to see them. We have to start understanding trauma responses, what's actually happening in the survivor as they're experiencing that abuse, why their bodies and their minds respond the way that they do. Because if we don't understand those things, if we don't understand memory fragmentation, it's very easy for us to chalk memory gaps up to, well, that must not have happened, or maybe it was just a dream. If we don't understand the fight, flight, or freeze response, it's very easy for us to chalk up the lack of crying out or delayed disclosure to, if it was really that serious, if it really happened the way you said, then you would have spoken up. Somebody was right there. They could have saved you. When we don't understand trauma responses, we miscategorize the disclosures that we're getting. And oftentimes we look at normal trauma responses as evidence that something hasn't happened, when in fact those trauma responses are actually evidence that it did. And what you're looking at is the damage that comes from it. And one of the ways that we often see this missed, especially in conservative circles, are teens or older children getting categorized as bad behavior or acting out, especially in a sexual context. It's very, very common for survivors of sexual abuse to act out sexually because in many ways they have ingested the message that this is all I am worth. But they are also often struggling to regain control of their sexuality. And to many survivors, it feels like if I can at least initiate the sexual encounter, even if it's a very abusive sexual encounter, then at least I'm wielding my sexuality rather than having it wielded against me. But because we don't understand those dynamics, oftentimes those teens who are struggling that way are just automatically categorized off as bad behavior or a rebellious teen, rather than looking to see what's under the surface. Again, oftentimes what we chalk off as not evidence of abuse actually is the damage from abuse that we're looking at. When we don't understand that, we miss the warning signs.
Particularly within the church, victims are often encouraged to forgive and forgive their abusers fairly quickly. This is something that you have given a great deal of thought to and struggled with yourself, and you've talked quite candidly about that. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about how do victims forgive their abusers, and how did you learn to do so?
Yeah, it's an incredibly personal journey, and it doesn't happen quickly. And part of what was so difficult, really, really ultimately, all of what I wrestled with was because of how the church taught forgiveness and justice. There was a significant part of me that didn't want to forgive because I knew the automatic response from the church would be, look at all the beautiful things that have come now. Aren't you thankful that God allowed that into your life? And it would be used to minimize and to mitigate the incredible damage that I was still suffering and the evil that was done to me. Now, I don't believe that's what biblical forgiveness actually means, but oftentimes that's how we treat it. We also treat forgiveness and justice as if they're dichotomous, almost in opposition to each other, when in fact both exist in the character and the work of Christ and in the nature of God himself. Forgiveness, biblical forgiveness, is rooted in a trust of God's justice, which is so much more complete. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay. So when I was able to wrestle through those realities and realize that forgiveness really meant releasing my own desire for vengeance and trusting God's complete justice, and that he cared about what was done to me, It allowed me to be able to release that desire for personal vengeance because I knew justice was coming. And it was coming perfectly because what was done to me mattered. But that's not the way we typically approach forgiveness in the Christian church. So when I'm walking alongside survivors, we don't start with the forgiveness discussion. That's something that you get to much, much later as the survivor is starting to wrestle through those realities and ask those questions themselves. We always start with the survivor. When I'm working with the survivor, I start with the book of Revelation, with that picture of Christ coming back with a robe dipped in blood, wielding a sword. I say, that's how much it matters to God. That's how much the evil that was done to you matters to him. If you do not feel the comfort and security of God's justice, then forgiveness is not possible. Forgiveness is rooted in God's perfect justice. And when we don't teach those two in tandem with each other, when we overemphasize one or we minimize the other, or we have an imbalanced perspective of one of them, we have destroyed the grounds for forgiveness.
This is a huge question, but obviously we want to not only be able to care for people who have suffered from abuse well, but also to safeguard the vulnerable going forward. And so I'd love to hear, I know you talk at quite a few universities, churches, corporations, and the like, about the practices and principles of essentially safeguarding the vulnerable, of channeling the use of power in ways that provide for flourishing rather than allow for abuse. And would love to get your thoughts both on how we individually can care for victims, but also how we as the Christian community should think about putting safeguards in place that constrain power and encourage its proper use.
Yeah, absolutely. On a personal level, again, it really starts with understanding what's being suffered and looking to the practical needs of the survivors. Some of the most meaningful things that were done during my court case by our church were just people bringing us meals, grocery shopping for me. They offered to come and clean my house. Members of our church did one time when I was away at court, so that I could come home to a clean house. Looking to remove the burdens that can be shared so that the ones that can't be shared can be borne more easily. So looking at those practical realities, being willing to sit in the grief with the survivor and to bear witness to the pain. When you're able to bear witness to something, it validates the reality of that thing. It allows time and space to grieve the evil non-destructively. And being able to grieve something in a way that isn't destructive is foundational to the healing journey. So just walking alongside and relieving the burdens that you can relieve. When it comes to our institutions, I get the question all the time, if there's one thing you could get an institution to do, what would it be? And usually when people ask that question, they're thinking policy. What's the most important child protection policy provision that I can put in place? And child protection policies are really important. We need to be doing background checks. You need to have a structure and a framework for how you're doing your policy. You need to have a very detailed crisis response. That's where a lot of churches don't. A lot of churches will have decent child protection policies, but they don't have any policy related to what to do when a crisis comes. Are we going to launch an independent investigation? What triggers that? What kind of firm are we looking for? How quickly can we get that done? Do we notify the church when an abuse allegation comes in? What about, not slandering and not gossiping? How do we process that theology? And so they have very poor crisis response in place. But the most important thing that a church can do, that a community can do, is message well on abuse for two reasons. One, your best chance at catching an abuser is to have a survivor disclose. But if a survivor cannot see that you understand the dynamics of abuse and you understand trauma and you understand power and authority dynamics, that you're intentional about that, if the survivor can't see that, they do not know that you're a safe place to disclose. And so they're not going to do so. Conversely, if the survivor sees you mishandling theology or talking about abuse or abuse-related issues, not just in your church, on your Facebook page, on your Twitter feed, what they're going to know is if that's the way they talk about this survivor or this abuse context, that's how much they would really understand mine. If they don't understand power dynamics here, they're not going to understand the power dynamics when I bring it to them. If they are slandering or making character attacks against the survivor in this public case, I run a very high risk that they're going to do that against me too. That's how much they really understand. So what you message on the issue of abuse, your level of intentionality, is what is going to signal to a survivor whether or not they can speak up. And that's your best bet at stopping an abuser. But it also signals to abusers whether or not your institution or community is a safe place to be. Because remember, abusers are very skilled manipulators. They look for communities they can manipulate. They look for communities that have the dynamics that make it conducive to abuse. Imbalanced power and authority structures, imbalanced theology, lack of proactivity, lack of messaging. So if you are messaging very clearly and teaching well on the issue of abuse, and you're handling your theology correctly, and you've got robust policies in place that are being proclaimed to your community so that they know about them, what you're really messaging to an abuser is you're not going to be safe here. And if you do something and someone speaks up, we're going to take it seriously and we're going to know what to do about it. And when you message that to an abuser, they know that your community is not a place that they want to be. How you message is the most important thing you can do to support and care well for survivors and to be able to catch and prevent abuse.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. There's so much more to ask you, but our time is already getting away from us. So we're going to turn to audience questions in just a second. But before doing so, I wanted to ask you one last question, and that is, having been through all of this yourself, and not just the disorientation and the trauma of the abuse, but you also lost your church over their response to sexual abuse at one point, and so have had that additional struggle. And so watching us today, we have nearly 1,600 people registered. There are going to be people who have gone through this, who have not reported, who have struggled with some of this alone and in silence. And would love for you just to kind of round this part of our conversation out with what counsel and encouragement you would offer to those viewers.
There are a couple of dynamics that have been really critical in my healing journey. And the first is to know what the truth is and what my identity is, what my value is, that it's not dependent on the societal response I receive. There's a quote by C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity that was just really impactful for me and really still is. Lewis wrote, "My argument against the universe was that God was so cruel and unjust. But where had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he first has some idea of straight." And there came a point in my faith journey where I said, I don't understand. I don't understand all of these dynamics. I don't understand why God seems so silent. I don't understand why this would be allowed. I don't understand why the church gets this wrong so often. But I can look at the character of God, and I can look at what he says about justice and about abuse of power and about standing for the vulnerable and the oppressed. And I can hold to that truth, even when I don't understand the other things. And I can say that what I've experienced is evil and it was wrong because the straight line does exist. I can say that the responses I experienced from my church, both when I was abused at age 7 and when I began advocating for survivors right around the time I disclosed. So I actually lost 2 churches over sexual abuse, my own and advocacy. I can say that the response I received was wrong because I understand that the straight line exists, the straight line of what a church is supposed to be, what God has designed the body of Christ to be, how he's defined trust and safety and security, all of these concepts that are being twisted and distorted. God's understanding of authority, the way he's defined authority and power, is servant-oriented. I can say that what I'm experiencing, even in my church, is broken and it's crooked because the straight line does exist. And when you can hold those 2 things, it gives you the ability to grieve the damage without feeling the pressure to minimize it or to mitigate it. Because the better you understand the good, the more you're going to feel the depth of the diversion from the good. And it also reminds me that I can look for the hope as well. So it's holding those things in tandem, giving myself time and space to grieve and to not minimize, and also at times being very intentional about looking for the hope and the beauty. Sometimes it would be something as simple as, on some of the very dark days, going for a walk with my kids and just being very intentional about the beauty. Do you feel the warm sun? Do you hear the birds? Do you see the flowers? And looking for God's gifts and God's care for us. And that allows you to hold those 2 truths in tandem, to see the hope and the redemption that's coming and the good that we've been given without minimizing or mitigating the darkness and the evil and the crookedness.
Thank you, Rachel. We're going to turn to questions from our viewers. And as Molly might have said earlier, you can not only ask a question, but you can also like questions. And that helps give us an idea of what some of the most popular questions are. They're already flooding in. We certainly won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll try to make our way through several. So one of our questions comes from Marlo Rondini, who asked, how do we stop the creation of new generations of abusers?
That is something psychiatrists are really wrestling with right now, is what creates this. Some of it is understanding trauma so that we can help undo the wounds of trauma and undo those neurobiological connections, develop healthy coping mechanisms to those neurobiological connections so that the next generation doesn't experience secondary trauma or primary trauma from someone who hasn't healed yet. The undoing of the trauma is very important. But I think we also have to start having some very hard discussions about our pornography culture. Because as much as we talk about actions, the action of abuse, it's ideas that drive our actions. So what is the idea driving sexual abuse or not thinking sexual abuse